At the age of 54, Pete Sampras still stands there as the cold and indisputable standard of American tennis, a name etched into history with numbers that make an entire generation bow their heads. 14 Grand Slam titles spread across 3 decades, 7 Wimbledon championships with a serve and volley game sharp as a razor, 5 U.S. Opens where the home pressure always crushed the faint-hearted, 2 Australian Opens affirming his global dominance, 6 consecutive years holding the world #1 ranking, more than 280 weeks at the top of the ATP, the year-end titles, and induction into the International Tennis Hall of Fame. The world called it perfect, called Sampras a flawless winning machine, the epitome of absolute consistency, the man who turned glory into a routine so regular it seemed almost inevitable. But right at the moment those golden records are read aloud, another truth quietly emerges. That peak didn't save the person inside. For Pete Sampras, those 14 Grand Slams weren't just achievements. They gradually became a life sentence, forcing him to carry the role of someone never allowed to tire, never allowed to miss a beat, never allowed to collapse. Every trophy raised was a reminder that he had to keep being strong, keep being silent, keep the machine running smoothly, even when it was running on empty inside. The world loved his precision, revered that perfect control, but few ever asked what the price was when a human being is imprisoned forever in perfection. Sampras learned to endure very early, learned to swallow emotions like a survival instinct, learned to let fear, loneliness, and exhaustion sink beneath the icy surface of victory. His willpower wasn't loud, wasn't explosive. It was a harsh endurance through every season, every final, every long night, when winning brought no peace. At the age of 54, Pete Sampras isn't forgotten, hasn't collapsed, hasn't been destroyed by scandal or public tragedy. And that's exactly what makes his story more heartbreaking. A lifetime passed in silence, in discipline and control so complete that no one noticed the man inside was never saved. He never fell in front of the world, because he was never allowed to. And in that crackless resilience, the real tragedy begins. The tragedy of a man who lived his entire life at the peak, but was rarely asked what he would do if one day he no longer had to win. If you want to understand what lies behind that cold perfection, subscribe to the channel so we can continue together into the deepest chapters of Pete Sampras's life, where glory is no longer the answer. Pete Sampras's childhood didn't take the shape of the tragedies people usually tell. No beatings, no abandonments in the dark, no broken family or extreme poverty. The home he grew up in California, was neat, orderly, proper, just like the man he would later become. His father was an engineer who believed in discipline, in reason, in children standing on their own 2 feet. His mother loved her children in a quiet, capable way, but rarely showed emotion. In that family, there was no cruelty, but also rarely any hugs. No one yelled at Pete, but no one stopped long enough to ask what the boy was thinking, what he was afraid of, or what he needed. Everything was fine, and that very word fine became the invisible wall around Pete's childhood. He grew up in a space where emotions weren't forbidden, but they weren't encouraged to exist either, where silence was seen as maturity, and self-control was the measure of worth. Pete learned very early that to be accepted, he didn't need to voice his sadness, didn't need to demand attention, and certainly didn't need anyone to understand him. He learned to self-regulate, to shrink himself as a natural reflex so as not to become a burden to anyone. In that world, strength wasn't a choice. It was an unspoken requirement, and Pete met that requirement by staying silent. No one told him, "Don't cry," but he understood that crying wouldn't do any good. No one said, "Take care of yourself," but he felt very clearly that taking care of himself was the only path. The absence of hugs didn't leave an obvious wound, but it left a lingering emptiness, an unnamed, untouched emotional space that was therefore never healed. Pete grew up as a good, quiet kid who didn't cause trouble, always doing what was expected. He didn't rebel, didn't demand, didn't resist, because from the start, he had learned that the safest way to exist was to exist in silence. When tennis entered Pete's life, it didn't arrive as a dazzling dream or a burning ambition, but as a refuge. On the court, that boy didn't have to speak, didn't have to explain, didn't have to reveal emotions. The racket became his only language, and the ball became the place where he could pour everything he had never learned to name. Every serve, every precise shot, was a way for Pete to affirm his value without needing anyone's permission, without needing anyone to understand. The boy gradually realized that control brought a sense of safety, that when everything was in his hands, he didn't have to face the chaos of emotions. And so, little by little, Pete built himself a shell of discipline, precision, perfection. Inside that shell, the fear of being overlooked, the fear of not being good enough, the fear of bothering others quietly grew, but was never named. His family didn't create tragedy, but they also didn't teach him how to face pain. They gave him a stable foundation, but didn't give him the language of emotions. And it was in that gap that Pete learned the most dangerous lesson of his life, that being strong meant needing no one, that enduring was a virtue, and that silence was the best way to survive. When that boy stepped into the world, carrying his racket and the discipline forged from his family, no one noticed that inside him was a person who had never been taught how to be weak. No one saw that Pete didn't reject care. He simply didn't know how to receive it. His childhood didn't leave horrifying memories, but it left a deeper mark. A man who grew up without knowing how to name his own pain. And that is the quietest tragedy, because a pain without a name will never find its way to healing. Tennis entered Pete Sampras's life not as a blazing dream ignited by ambition, but as a quiet door opening for a child who needed to escape from the emotional world he didn't know how to face. Pete didn't grow up dreaming of becoming a legend, nor did he carry shining images of trophies in his mind. He came to the racket quietly, almost by chance, and there he found something his disciplined but emotionally cold family had never given him: ordered silence. On the court, everything was clear. Ball trajectories had paths, scores had rules, wins and losses were decided by cold numbers. There, Pete didn't have to say he was sad, didn't have to explain his fear, didn't have to beg anyone to understand. He just had to hit the ball, repeat it, precisely, and without emotion. Tennis became a bunker, where Pete could hide from the voids inside that he had never been taught to name. When others saw talent, Pete felt safety. When the world started paying attention, Pete felt shielded by discipline and control. It wasn't burning passion. It was the survival need of a child who learned to exist by never showing any cracks. The decision to switch to a one-handed backhand, a difficult, less safe choice that demanded absolute precision, wasn't just a technical decision. It was the perfect reflection of Pete the person. In a sport increasingly favoring two-handed stability and power, Pete chose the lonelier path, where mistakes weren't allowed to exist. The one-handed backhand demanded absolute trust in himself, because when that shot collapsed, there was no backup plan. And Pete, from a very young age, was used to having no one standing behind him to catch him. No coach, no family, no one could shield him from the invisible pressures he placed on his own shoulders. On the court, Pete learned to become his own sole protector, learned to lock emotions away so his hands wouldn't shake, so he wouldn't miss a beat, so weakness wouldn't seep into every stroke. Tennis thus wasn't just a sport, it was the psychological structure that helped him survive. Every hours-long practice session, every numbing repetition of drills, was a way for Pete to avoid facing the questions he didn't know how to answer. Who am I when I'm not strong? What will I be if I can't control everything? The boy gradually understood that on the court, emotion was the enemy. Just one moment of hesitation, 1 second for fear to rise, and everything could collapse. And so Pete chose to slam that door shut. He didn't let joy explode, didn't give sadness a chance to exist. Everything was compressed into cold focus, into serves like hammer blows, into a style of play so efficient it felt emotionless. Outsiders called it composure, maturity beyond his years. But inside, it was a child running away, using tennis as armor so he wouldn't have to touch his own fragile parts. Pete didn't play to dream, he played to not feel. Every match was a sealed room where emotions were locked outside, where only the sound of ball meeting racket and controlled breathing remained. When victory came, he didn't cheer. When defeat happened, he didn't scream. Everything was handled in silence, the way he had learned from his family and from his fear of being hurt. Tennis gave Pete a safe refuge, but it also began building the first invisible prison of his life, because the longer he hid in that control, the more Pete forgot how to step out, forgot that emotions weren't always the enemy. Tennis wasn't Pete Sampras's dream. It was where he learned to survive, and it was from that very bunker that a man was gradually forged into a legend, carrying with him a silent tragedy, safety, built on running away from himself. The U.S. Open 1990 didn't enter Pete Sampras's life like a dazzling coronation, but like the moment a child is placed under a crown too heavy for shoulders that haven't finished growing. At just 19 years old, Pete stepped onto the center court at Flushing Meadows, with a face still boyish, eyes always trying to stay calm, as if he were doing everything possible not to reveal that he wasn't ready for what was about to come. The world saw a rare talent, a young phenomenon who defeated big names with a play so coldly unbelievable. But inside, it was still just a boy who had never been taught how to face emotions, now thrown straight into the whirlwind of expectations, fame, and lights that never go out. When Pete beat Andre Agassi in the final, history instantly changed color. People called it a generational victory, a transfer of power, the start of a new era. But no one stopped to ask what had just been taken away. The U.S. Open trophy handed to that teenager wasn't just a reward, it was a harsh covenant. From that moment, Pete Sampras no longer had the right to grow up slowly like everyone else. He was no longer allowed to make mistakes, to feel confused, to search for himself in the hazy turns of youth. Everything suddenly became too fast, too bright, too heavy. The media built an icon overnight, while Pete stood there, lost in his own victory. The smile when lifting the trophy looked proper, but not complete. The eyes looking toward the cheering stands found no familiar anchor. That victory didn't bring a sense of liberation. It felt more like a door slamming shut behind him, locking him in a role he hadn't even chosen yet. From that day, Pete was no longer a boy playing tennis to escape emotions. He became the champion, a title that demanded constant, unrelenting perfection. Every next step was scrutinized, every loss seen as a sign of decline, every moment of silence interpreted as coldness. No one realized that behind that crown was a terrified child who didn't understand why he didn't feel happy the way he was supposed to. Pete later admitted that he didn't know what to do with that victory, that his feeling wasn't joy but overwhelming paralysis. But at that time, there was no room for such confessions. The fame machine had started running, and Pete was pulled along like a gear forced to turn in perfect rhythm. The U.S. Open 1990 became the starting line for a string of years, where every season was a brutal test of endurance. Instead of being allowed to discover who he was off the court, Pete had to keep proving that that win wasn't a fluke. The pressure didn't come from one side, it came from every direction, from experts waiting for consistency, from fans expecting cold performances, from Pete himself, who began to believe his value only existed when he showed no cracks. That crown gradually tightened, making every breath heavier. While his peers were still figuring out who they were and what they wanted, Pete was already framed as the winner. No one asked if he was afraid, if he was tired, if he craved a different life. And he didn't ask himself either, because from that moment, Pete learned a new lesson. Victory doesn't allow doubt, and fame doesn't accept weakness. The U.S. Open 1990, therefore, wasn't the beginning of glory. It was the first turning point, the event that took away Pete's right to grow up like a normal person. It placed on his shoulders the burden of national expectations, of history being written day by day, and of the perfect image he had to maintain so as not to disappoint anyone. In the blinding lights of New York, amid the deafening cheers, no one saw a child slowly closing the doors of his heart to survive. And it was from that very moment that Pete Sampras's tragedy began to take clear shape, a life built on victory, but robbed of the chance to mature slowly, to fall safely, to learn how to live outside the frame of a trophy. The U.S. Open 1990 gave him the title, but it also quietly stole his youth in the cruelest way. After the U.S. Open 1990, Pete Sampras's path didn't open up like a grand avenue leading to freedom. It gradually closed into a narrow corridor, where every step forward was monitored by expectations, and every breath had to follow the rhythm of victory. When Pete rose to world number one, the world called it a well-deserved reward. For Pete, it was the moment the only door behind him was locked shut. Number one was no longer just a ranking. It became his identity. There was no room for mistakes, no space for fatigue, no language for weakness. Everything had to be right, precise, cold. A missed shot was no longer a technical error. It was a question of worthiness. A loss was no longer a learning experience. It was proof of decline. Pete understood that very clearly, and that very understanding turned every day of competition into a day of imprisonment in the invisible cage called the top. When you're number one, the world doesn't wait for you to improve. They wait for you not to be allowed to slip back. Pete entered every tournament like walking into an interrogation room, where every eye examined whether he still held the shape of perfection. Victories followed one after another, but joy never had time to take root. Each win, instead of unlocking, tightened another chain. Win today means you have to win tomorrow. Win this week means the whole season can't afford a misstep. Pete wasn't allowed to be tired, because tired was a sign of weakness. Pete wasn't allowed to be weak, because weakness was unforgivable at number one. And so Pete learned to deny his body, ignore the signals of fatigue, brush aside emotional fluctuations as if they didn't exist. Control became his religion, discipline his morality, and silence his vow. On court, he was the embodiment of precision. Off court, he gradually disappeared behind the name the media repeated over and over. Pete Sampras was no longer a person with good days and bad days. It was a brand that had to run smoothly. People demanded consistency from him, not authenticity, coldness, not vitality. And Pete, with all his fear of slipping from the top, met those demands by withdrawing himself from the world of emotions. He didn't complain, didn't explain, didn't reveal. Every time he stood in front of a microphone, he said just enough. Every time he faced a crowd, he smiled properly. Inside, questions had nowhere to hide. If I lose one day, who am I? If I'm not perfect, will I still be accepted? Those questions weren't allowed to surface, because they could shake the foundation of the winning machine. Pete chose silence not because he had no emotions, but because emotions became a threat. When he defeated opponents with near-emotionless coldness, the world called it composure. They didn't see the price of always wearing that mask. Seasons passed in packed schedules, back-to-back flights, indistinguishable hotels, and, in the middle of it all, Pete lived in a closed loop of victory and loneliness. Friends drifted away, because no one knew how to enter his world. Simple joys became a luxury, because joy could dull focus. Sadness was seen as dangerous, because it could make hands shake. And so, Pete chose a state of icy neutrality, Never too happy, never too sad, just enough to compete and stay on top. But that very state eroded him bit by bit. World number one gave him no escape, because escape meant leaving the position his entire career had been built to defend. Pete began to live like a name engraved on the rankings, not like a human being with needs for rest and understanding. He existed in the role of the one who can't make mistakes, and that role gradually swallowed every other part of his life. Wins no longer brought a sense of conquest. They only confirmed the cage was still intact. And every time he raised a trophy, the world applauded the greatness, while Pete quietly felt another chain locked tighter around him. At number one, no cheer was loud enough to drown out the loneliness, and no victory strong enough to open the closed door. Pete Sampras kept going, kept winning, kept silent, because that was the only way he knew to survive in the prison called the Peak. At the peak of his career, when Pete Sampras had almost everything a tennis player could dream of in his hands, a bitter paradox slowly came to light. He won everything except the heart of the public. The packed stands, the thunderous applause every time he served like lightning, the articles praising his absolute consistency and standard, all of it existed, but it never transformed into love. Sampras was respected, admired, but rarely embraced fully in the crowd's emotions. In America, where sports aren't just about achievements, but also about stories, where audiences want to see pain, rebellion, falls, and comebacks, Pete Sampras appeared as a cold wall, perfect to the point of leaving no gap for empathy. He didn't tell stories, didn't reveal, didn't give the audience a reason to step into his inner world, and in that emptiness, love couldn't take root. In complete contrast, Andre Agassi stepped onto the court like a challenge to every old standard. Long hair, flashy clothes, open rebellion, public confessions of fear, pressure, and inner conflict. Agassi showed the audience the human behind the racket, and America, with its instinct for loving redemption stories, embraced him. Every time Agassi came back after a defeat, the crowd roared, as if witnessing themselves standing up. Every time he fell, the audience hurt with him. Meanwhile, Sampras, even standing on the winning side, often stood alone. When those two men faced each other, the court wasn't just divided into two halves. The crowd's emotions were split too. Pete hit the ball precisely, coldly, ruthlessly efficient. Agassi fought with full emotional exposure. The scoreboard usually tilted toward Sampras, but the atmosphere in the stands belonged to Agassi. Pete could win the match, but the cheers often went to his opponent. It wasn't hatred. It was the crowd's unconscious choice. They chose the one who made them feel seen. Sampras never publicly complained about it. He didn't criticize the audience, didn't blame the media, but that silence didn't mean he didn't feel it. Deep down, Pete understood he was living in a painful paradox. The more perfect he was, the more distant he became. The more he kept himself closed off, the harder it was to be loved. Every time he stepped onto a home court, he carried not just the pressure to win, but also a vague fear that the victory wouldn't buy him belonging. Articles calling him a machine, cold, emotionless, unintentionally deepened the gap. They turned Pete into a concept, not a human being. And when a human being is turned into a concept, they're no longer allowed to show weakness in front of the crowd. Sampras didn't cry on court, didn't smash rackets, didn't celebrate wildly. Those gestures, which serve as emotional bridges to the audience, were avoided by him like dangers that could shatter his control. But that very control left him isolated. To the American public, Pete was someone they trusted would win, but not someone they felt needed to protect. He didn't become a symbol of resistance, didn't represent a journey through darkness in an obvious way. He only represented victory. And victory, ironically, is often something people admire from afar rather than love up close. In the quiet moments after matches, as the stands emptied, Pete stood alone with a hard-to-name sense of disconnection. He had beaten his opponents, but he couldn't beat the invisible distance between himself and the crowd. No one hated him, but not many felt he belonged to them. That is the deepest social pain. Not being rejected, but standing outside the embrace. Pete Sampras won in front of millions, but lost the battle to belong. He never became the hero of redemption stories, because he never allowed his own story to be told. And so, amid polite applause and proper praise, Pete continued to exist as a lonely icon, carrying within him a tragedy quieter than any defeat. The tragedy of a man who did everything right, but never found a place to set his heart down and say, "Here, I am loved." After all the applause for victories and the silences for the public's incomplete love, Pete Sampras continued down his path with a habit so ingrained it became instinct, swallowing the pain inward. He didn't tell his story, didn't explain why he was so quiet, didn't defend himself against the labels the world pinned on him. In a culture that celebrates openness, where athletes are encouraged to share pressure, cry on camera, turn wounds into inspiring narratives, Pete Sampras chose the opposite: silence. Not because he had nothing to say, but because he didn't know where to start, and also didn't believe that speaking would bring anything beyond distraction. For Pete, silence wasn't an attitude. It was a survival mechanism forged in childhood, reinforced at the peak, and nailed down by the expectations of an entire sport. Every time he was called cold, he didn't argue back. Every time he was compared to more explosive personalities, he didn't justify himself. Every time he lost one of those rare matches, he didn't talk about sleepless nights, prolonged exhaustion, nameless anxieties. Everything was compressed, pressed down, as if emotions were something that had to be tightly controlled, so as not to shake the perfect structure he had painstakingly built. Pete understood very clearly the cost of a single moment of exposure. Just one slip of the tongue, one misplaced tear, and the image of the one who can't make mistakes could collapse. And so he chose the safest way: let no one see anything at all. On court, that turned into cold focus, unshaking shots, matches ending without emotional explosions. Off court, it turned into distant, short conversations, just enough answers, early withdrawals from the spotlight. Friends struggled to enter his world, not because he rejected them, but because he never showed the door. Every emotion, from fleeting joy to simmering sadness, was swallowed whole and stored where no one could see. The tragedy here had no explosion, no dramatic collapse for the media to capture. It accumulated like erosion, day by day, season by season, flight after flight. Pete's body could stay healthy, but his mind constantly bore the pressure of maintaining perfection in silence. The nervous tension, the restless nights before matches, the fleeting moments of self-doubt, all were brushed aside, not because they didn't exist, but because there was no room for them to exist. Pete didn't allow himself to complain of fatigue, because fatigue was a sign of weakness. He didn't allow himself to feel sad, because sadness could slow his rhythm. He also didn't allow himself too much joy, because joy could loosen focus. The result was a prolonged neutral state, where emotions were flattened to serve performance. The world called it steely resolve, but inside, it was the gradual numbing of a man who no longer knew how to feel. Pete didn't fight the misunderstandings, because fighting them required speaking out, and speaking out meant opening a door he had locked long ago. He accepted being misunderstood as a necessary price to keep the winning machine running. But that price wasn't just image, it was the quiet erosion of his inner self. No one saw Pete collapse, but no one saw him being lifted up either. Each season ended, and he stepped into the next, with the same burden, never set down. And when victories came, they didn't bring relief. They only confirmed he had to keep swallowing more. In Pete Sampras's world, pain wasn't something to be resolved. It was something to be managed. He managed it with discipline, with control, with silence, But managed pain doesn't disappear. It just changes form. It becomes a hard-to-name loneliness, an unacknowledged exhaustion, and an emptiness that seeps in even during moments of victory. This is the tragedy of a man who doesn't tell his story, not because he has no story, but because he lived too long in the belief that telling it is a forbidden form of weakness. And in that swallowing of emotions, Pete Sampras kept moving forward, not exploding, not collapsing, just quietly eroded bit by the very strength the world had praised in him. Tim Gullikson entered Pete Sampras's life not as an ordinary coach, but as the first man to make him feel understood without having to explain. In Pete's world, where every relationship was measured by discipline, performance, and silence, Tim was the rare exception. He didn't try to change Pete, didn't force him to talk more, didn't demand that he open up. Tim was simply there, quiet, patient, steady, like an invisible pillar. For Pete, Tim wasn't just the man who fine-tuned his serve or adjusted tactics on court. He was the only spiritual father Pete ever had, the one standing close enough behind him that Pete knew if he ever faltered, someone would see it. And that was exactly why, when Tim Gullikson was diagnosed with brain cancer, Pete's world began to crack in a way he had never prepared for. At first, it was only cautious bad news, reassurances that everything would be okay, that modern medicine could work miracles. Pete listened, nodded, and kept competing. He was too used to continuing, too used to never stopping for anything. But unlike every previous pressure, this time he couldn't completely lock his emotions away. Every time he stepped onto the court, the image of Tim in his mind was no longer the strong coach on the sideline, but a man steadily weakening, day by day. Pete didn't tell anyone about that fear. He didn't share, didn't ask for time off, didn't allow himself to admit he was panicking. He just hit the ball, the way he had learned to survive. The Australian Open, 1995, took place in an atmosphere where Pete felt the fragility of everything, with painful clarity. On paper, he was still the top favorite, still the winning machine the world trusted. But inside, every match was a different battle, one where he had to keep his emotions from spilling over. Then came the fateful moment, when Pete walked onto court for the quarterfinal against Jim Courier. The match was tense, long, every point stretching his already worn-out nerves to the limit. And then, in the middle of that match, amid the cheers and blinding lights, the wall Pete had built his entire life suddenly collapsed. Not because he was losing, not because of a bad shot or a tactical mistake, but because the fear of losing Tim, the fear of losing the only anchor he had ever had, finally broke through the layers of control. Pete burst into tears on court. The tears came unexpectedly, without drama, without noise, but enough to stun the entire world. It wasn't the moment of a defeated athlete. It was the moment of a human being, allowing himself to feel pain for the first time. The crowd went silent. His opponent stood waiting, and Pete, the man who had never shown emotion, stood there trembling, trying to catch his breath. In those brief minutes, all the years of swallowing emotions, all the buried fears, all the accumulated loneliness, finally found an exit. It was the most fragile moment of his career, but also the most real. The world saw Pete Sampras not as the winning machine, but as a man terrified of losing someone he loved. But that moment was also the last time Pete ever allowed it to happen. After the match, Pete kept winning, went deeper in the tournament, and even won the title. History recorded that title as proof of extraordinary mental toughness. But history didn't record the price Pete paid in silence afterward. When Tim Gullikson passed away a year later, Pete lost the only person who had ever stood on the boundary between his work and his emotions. That pain never exploded again. There were no more public tears, no long confessions. Instead, Pete slammed shut the emotional door he had accidentally opened on the Melbourne court. He retreated deeper into control, into discipline, into absolute silence. The moment at the Australian Open, 1995, became a hidden scar, evidence that he was capable of feeling deeply, but also a warning that if he let emotions spill, he could collapse. Pete chose the safest path he knew: lock everything down. After Tim, Pete no longer allowed anyone to get close enough to hurt him like that again. He kept competing, kept winning, kept standing at the top, but with a greater distance between himself and the world. Relationships became shallower. Sharing became rarer. He didn't let anyone into that vulnerable space again. Tim Gullikson didn't just leave Pete's life. He took with him the rare chance for Pete to learn how to face pain in a different way. From that day on, Pete Sampras returned to the version of himself the world knew: cold, precise, expressionless. But beneath that shell, the moment he cried on the Australian Open 1995 court remained as a painful memory, reminding him that he had once allowed himself to feel, and that the price of doing so was too high. The tragedy of Pete wasn't that he cried in front of millions. It was that he decided that would be the last time. From the day Tim Gullikson left, Pete Sampras never allowed himself to feel pain again. And in that closing off, a lifetime of silence was permanently reinforced, leaving behind a man who kept winning but carried an emptiness that would never be filled. After the moment the tears fell on the Australian Open 1995 court, the world thought Pete Sampras had experienced a release, that the emotional door that had cracked open would lead him to a healthier path, a path where pain was acknowledged and then slowly healed. But the opposite happened. For Pete, those tears were not recovery. They were the final warning. He had seen too clearly what would happen if he let emotions pour out: the trembling, the loss of control, the fear that he might collapse right in front of the eyes of the entire world. And so, after those rare tears, Pete chose absolute silence. No more crying, no more revealing, no more allowing anyone, not even himself, to touch the fragile part that had been exposed. Silence was no longer a habit. It became a survival mechanism. On court, Pete Sampras returned to the most familiar image of himself: cold, precise, unshaken. He hit the ball like a perfectly programmed machine, where every serve, every movement, every decision was executed without emotion guiding it. To the fans and experts, this was proof of steely resolve. But inside, it was the sign of paralysis. Pete no longer allowed himself to feel pain because feeling meant having to face it. And facing it, in his experience, was too dangerous. In the years that followed, with Tim Gullikson gone, Pete continued to compete as if nothing had changed. No long speeches, no sharing of loss, no seeking public comfort. He returned to the familiar grind of packed schedules, back-to-back flights, indistinguishable hotels that blurred days into months. That routine brought a sense of safety. Because it didn't require feeling, each day was filled with practice, matches, physical recovery. Emotions, if they appeared, were immediately pushed back. Pete didn't allow himself to hurt again, not because he didn't hurt, but because he was afraid of what would happen if he let that pain exist. Gradually, the silence didn't just cover sadness. It flattened every other feeling too. The joy of victory became brief, faint. The thrill of historic moments no longer strong enough to break through the control shell. Pete raised trophies, smiled properly, then returned to the locker room with the familiar emptiness. He didn't collapse, but he didn't recover either. Instead, he adapted by numbing his emotions, as a way to keep surviving at the top without being torn apart from within. That silence spread to his life off the court, too. Pete shared less, connected less. Relationships around him became functional, tied to work and schedules, rather than emotional bonds. He didn't seek comfort, and didn't know where to look for it. Friends, colleagues, even the closest people sensed an invisible distance, as if Pete was always standing behind a thick pane of glass. He was there, but not truly present. His body kept performing at the highest level, but his mind gradually shrank to avoid emotional impacts. Sleepless nights, fleeting anxiety before big matches didn't disappear. They were just suppressed, treated like technical glitches to be fixed, rather than signals to be heard. Pete handled pain the way he handled a bad shot. Adjust the technique, increase discipline, and keep going. But emotions don't work that way. They don't vanish just because they're ignored. They accumulate, quietly, in the spaces that schedules can't fill. And so, while the world saw a Pete Sampras who grew more consistent, colder, more like the unshakable image of the man who can't be rattled, inside him a growing numbness spread. Not crying didn't mean the pain was gone. Not revealing didn't mean peace. It was the state of a man who had decided that feeling was too dangerous, that silence was the only choice to keep going. Pete didn't recover after the Australian Open 1995 moment. He adapted by freezing. Silence became armor, but also prison. It protected him from new emotional shocks, but at the same time blocked any remaining chance of healing. From then on, Pete Sampras competed not just to beat opponents, but to maintain his fragile control over himself. He kept going, kept winning, kept standing at the top, but with an increasingly clear emptiness where emotions were supposed to exist. After the tears, only silence remained. And in that silence, Pete Sampras didn't break, but he was no longer whole. The U.S. Open 2002 came to Pete Sampras not like a triumphant chapter, but as the quiet ending to a long campaign that had drained every ounce of his strength. 12 years after that first crown in 1990, Pete returned to New York no longer as the absolute ruler, but as a man who had carried the weight of himself for too long. His body was no longer at its prime, his form no longer consistent, and questions about retirement had hovered over him for many seasons. No one was betting big on Sampras anymore, not even himself. But, in the familiar paradox of his life, Pete advanced, round by round, more by survival instinct than conquering ambition. When he stood in the final, facing Andre Agassi, history seemed to close in a perfect circle. Two men representing two kinds of American men, two opposing destinies, two paths that had never truly intersected. Pete won. The 14th Grand Slam title was etched into the golden record, a world record at the time, a milestone people believed would stand forever. Historically, it was the perfect ending that couldn't have been written better. But inside Pete Sampras, there were no fireworks, no sense of relief, no bursting joy, only the deep exhaustion of a man who had gone too far without knowing where he was headed. When he lifted the trophy, Pete smiled, but it was the smile of duty, not deliverance. The crowd roared. The media instantly called him an immortal legend, the eternal standard. But in that moment, Pete felt a terrifying emptiness. The final victory didn't bring closure. It only confirmed he had completed the role the world had assigned him. 14 Grand Slams stood there as a perfect summary, but also as a silent sentence. Everything was finished, and nothing was left to feel. Pete didn't cry, didn't tremble, didn't reveal anything. He was too accustomed to not allowing emotions into moments that were supposed to be happy. As he left the court, there was no inner explosion, only a pervasive weariness spreading through his body. The years of silence, control, and endurance condensed into a heavy mass, and this victory didn't dissolve it. It only closed the last door leading out. The U.S. Open 2002 didn't save Pete Sampras from emptiness. It only put a period at the end of a journey he had traveled too long in solitude. People said he left at the right time, at the peak, leaving no regrets in terms of achievements. But no one asked what he left with in his heart. No one saw that the victory wasn't a reward, but the final confirmation that all the effort, all the discipline, all the silence had been repaid by history, but hadn't given him back the feeling of being alive. Pete walked into the locker room after the final the way he had throughout his career, alone. No wild celebration, no need to share. The trophy stood there, gleaming, but it couldn't say what Pete needed to hear. It didn't say he had been freed. It didn't say he could stop and breathe. It only said the mission was complete, and for a man accustomed to living by missions, that was a terrifying void. From that moment, Pete understood that no more victories could save him. No more titles could bring peace. The U.S. Open 2002 was the final win, but also the clearest proof of his life's tragedy. When you've lived as a name, an icon, a winning machine, even the greatest moment isn't enough to make you feel like a whole human being. That victory didn't open a new door. It only closed a long corridor of silence, where Pete Sampras stood still, exhausted, carrying history on his shoulders, and for the first time faced the question he had avoided his whole life. If he no longer had to win, what was left? When the U.S. Open 2002 ended, and Pete Sampras left the court in silence, the world believed he had a perfect farewell. No grand announcement, no elaborate retirement ceremony, no prolonged tribute tour. Pete simply vanished from the schedule, the way he had always done with things he didn't know how to say. But that withdrawal wasn't a decisive leap. It was a slow, prolonged fall, where the sound of the crowds gradually faded, and the emptiness began to echo. When the arena went quiet, Pete faced no place left to hide for the first time. No applause to cover his breathing, no schedule to fill the days, no clear goal to force emotions aside. Every morning he woke, his body still remembered decades of routine, practice time, meal time, recovery time. But the calendar was blank. The regularity that had once been his lifeline was gone, leaving an unnamed void. Pete didn't panic, didn't collapse in front of the media. He didn't publicly talk about an identity crisis, didn't recount sleepless nights or aimless days. He just kept living, quietly, as if waiting for a signal he didn't know where it would come from. Retirement didn't take away his fame. It took away structure. And when structure vanished, the long frozen emotions began to surface in a very different way. Not fiercely, not explosively, but wearily. Pete faced a prolonged emptiness, where each passing day was no longer measured by wins or losses, but by how to let the day pass peacefully. He tried to fill the time with ordinary things, family, friends, simple pleasures, but everything felt foreign, as if he were relearning how to live without the familiar role. On court, Pete had always known exactly what to do at every point. Off court, there were no clear rules to cling to. No one demanded he win, but no one told him where to go next either. The silence grew thicker, not from lack of noise, but from lack of purpose. Pete didn't feel like a failure. He felt lost. And lost, for a man who had lived his entire life by discipline and control, was the most terrifying state. He didn't talk much about those early years after retirement, because even to himself, he had no language to describe them. No more pressure, but no more drive either. No more need to prove, but no more reason to try. Evenings passed more slowly than ever. No crowd noise in his head. Only the repeated question, who am I when I don't have to win anymore? Pete didn't seek the spotlight to fill that void. He stayed away from media, away from ambassador roles, away from becoming an icon talking about himself, because doing so would force him to face a story he wasn't ready to tell. Instead, he accepted the silence, like an empty room where he could exist without demands. But that room didn't bring immediate peace. It only gave him time. Time to feel the accumulated fatigue, to realize that winning had once been the only way he knew to define his worth. When that disappeared, he had to start over. Slowly, clumsily, no dramatic fall, no public crisis for the press to chase, just a man who once lived at the peak, now learning to walk on level ground, step by step, in silence. The court was quiet, and in that quietness, Pete Sampras didn't collapse. He simply drifted quietly, like a man finally forced to face the emptiness that victory had hidden his whole life. After those years of silent courts and the prolonged emptiness after retirement, Pete Sampras stepped into another phase of his life, not with applause, but with the quiet presence of someone who didn't demand he become anything. His marriage to Bridget Wilson didn't arrive like a fairy tale of a legend meeting his muse, but as a belated refuge for a man who had grown exhausted from holding himself together for too long. Bridget didn't love the image of Pete Sampras on the record books, wasn't drawn to the 14 Grand Slams or the records that once made the whole world bow. What she saw first was a quiet, guarded man, carrying the accumulated fatigue of years of endurance. In that gaze there were no expectations to keep winning, no demands to prove himself, no questions like, how many more titles do you have left? For the first time in his adult life, Pete didn't need to win to be allowed to stay. He didn't need to be perfect to be accepted. No one in that relationship required him to be stronger, colder, or to keep playing the role of someone never allowed to be weak. And that very lack of demands became a form of very late salvation. Not loud, not promising healing, but enough for him to breathe. Bridget didn't try to pry open Pete's tightly closed emotional door with questions or advice. She was simply there, patient, letting the door open on its own when and if Pete was ready. That presence was entirely different from every relationship before in his life, where everything was tied to function, schedules, and expectations. Here, Pete didn't need to be on time for practice, didn't need to win for recognition, didn't need to maintain an image for the crowd. He could be silent without being misunderstood, could be tired without being seen as weak. But this love didn't erase the scars that had formed long before. Pete didn't suddenly become an expressive person, didn't recount his past with floods of emotion. The years of emotional numbness didn't vanish just because someone was by his side. They were still there, quietly, as part of an inner structure built too long to dismantle quickly. Love didn't heal Pete Sampras, and perhaps it never intended to. It only created a space where he didn't have to keep holding himself rigid. In that space, Pete relearned very small things, sitting still without feeling anxious, spending time without feeling useless, being next to someone without needing to play any role. That wasn't explosive happiness, it was a rare steadiness, a different kind of quiet, not to hide, but to rest. The marriage didn't bring ostentatious romance either. Pete and Bridget lived discreetly, away from the lights, away from stories that had to be told to the public. For Pete, that wasn't running away, it was protecting the most fragile thing he had gained after his career ended, because he understood that if this love were placed under the pressure of expectations and scrutiny, it could collapse, just like everything else that had ever been put on his shoulders. In married life, Pete didn't find answers to the big questions about identity, but he found acceptance for the gaps that couldn't yet be filled. Bridget didn't ask why he didn't talk much, didn't push him to change to become more lovable. She accepted the person in front of her, with all that silence and fatigue, and that acceptance gave Pete a new feeling, the feeling of being allowed to stay without paying the price of victory. But this salvation came very late. It didn't bring Pete back to his youth, didn't erase the years lived more as a name than as a human being. It only arrived in time to keep him from sliding deeper into the emptiness after retirement. Love, in Pete Sampras's story, wasn't a miracle. It didn't make him forget the past, didn't instantly make him less lonely. It only allowed him to breathe more slowly, live more slowly, and accept that some wounds would never fully heal. And in a life accustomed to enduring in silence, the ability to breathe, even if very late, was already a rare grace. When he stepped into the role of father, Pete Sampras didn't bring lessons of victory or a glorious legacy to pass on. He brought a quiet, unnamed fear. The fear that his children would have to live a life forced upon them the way his was. The birth of his children didn't ignite in Pete a desire to continue the legend. It awakened memories of a boy once taught to be strong too early, too long, with no right to choose how he grew up. For the first time, Pete faced the question his whole life had avoided. What happens if a child is loved without being burdened with the expectation of becoming someone? Fatherhood made Pete look back at himself not as a legend, but as that old child still standing somewhere in memory, learning to swallow tears so as not to disappoint anyone. He didn't talk much to his kids about trophies or records. He observed, listened, and was careful, almost anxious, about every sign of talent or small ambition. Not because he feared failure, but because he feared success. Coming too early would steal his children's right to be weak, just as it had once stolen his. Pete knew the price of having a crown placed on your head when you were too young. It didn't just bring fame, it brought a lifelong silent sentence, and he didn't want to pass that sentence on. In everyday moments, watching his children play without being measured, Pete felt a different kind of happiness, fragile but real. At the same time, it carried a deep, wordless regret. He wondered what would have been different if someone back then had told him it was okay to be tired. That weakness wasn't a betrayal of talent. That regret didn't erupt into complaints. It was quiet, like every other emotion in his life. Pete didn't stand in front of a mirror to blame himself, didn't write a memoir to confess. He just lived more slowly, observed more, and tried to create a space where his children didn't need to win to be allowed to stay. But generational tragedy doesn't disappear just because you're aware of it. Pete knew that his silence, even without intention to impose, could still unintentionally become a model. He feared his children would learn to hide emotions like he did, learn to please the world instead of listening to themselves. That fear made Pete softer, but also more vulnerable. There were nights he woke up, thinking of words he had never spoken. I wish I had allowed myself to be weaker, not to escape responsibility, but to have lived more fully in the years that had passed. Fatherhood didn't bring complete healing to Pete Sampras. It opened another door to confrontation, where he saw clearly the consequences of a life of unrelenting discipline. But it also gave him a belated chance to do things right in a different way, without forcing, without measuring, without turning love into a reward for achievement. In quiet hugs, in unconditional presence, Pete learned to allow the next generation a choice he never had. And though the wordless regret remained there, like an unfading shadow, Pete accepted carrying it as a gentle reminder that true strength isn't in never being weak, but in knowing when you no longer need to be strong. At the age of 54, Pete Sampras lives like a man who has deliberately stepped out of the story the world still wants to tell for him. Not because he hates the past, but because he understands clearly the price of living forever in nostalgia. Pete avoids the spotlight, not with coldness, but with choice. He doesn't appear often at tributes, isn't eager to sit in the honored seats to hear his name called again. The trophies have their place in history. He doesn't need to stand beside them to prove it. Pete's greatness, paradoxically, shows most clearly in his decision to leave while he still could, and to keep leaving every day after, away from the invitations of memory. His body carries history in the quietest way. No need to tell, it speaks for itself. Joints aching when the weather changes, mornings that need longer warm-ups, small signs reminding that years at the top were never free. Pete doesn't complain. He doesn't boast either. For him, history isn't something to display. It's something etched into flesh and skin that deserves respect by living more slowly. He chooses a discreet rhythm, staying away from conversations where the past is dissected like an artifact. Not because he fears facing it, but because he has faced it enough in silence his entire life. Pete also avoids nostalgia in his own way. He doesn't sit and rewatch tapes to recapture the feeling of winning. He doesn't compare generations to affirm his place. Debates about the greatest no longer interest him. Not because he doubts his legacy, but because he doesn't want to become the guardian of an empty throne. For Pete, the past is a journey that closed at the right time. Dwelling on it too long only suffocates the present. He chooses to live in the now, where value doesn't come from numbers, but from the rare peace after years of endurance. Some people leave to be remembered more. Pete left to be at peace. That difference says it all. He doesn't try to redefine himself to the public, doesn't write a memoir to reveal hidden corners in sensational ways. He doesn't turn his experience into preached lessons either. What needed to be said, he said through his choices in living. Less, slower, and enough. In everyday life, Pete is present as an ordinary man, a husband, a father, without the need for recognition. That is a belated but real liberation. Even so, this quiet doesn't mean inner forgetting. The marks of a life of harsh discipline are still there, sometimes rising in very small moments. An afternoon too quiet, a casual question about back then, an old image flashing by. Pete doesn't chase them away. He learns to walk with them. Unlike before, when emotions had to be swallowed to keep winning, now he allows them to exist without needing action. Not to dig them up, but to acknowledge them. That is late maturity, arriving after all the titles had been awarded. In the way Pete walks today, there is a rare quality, fullness without needing proof. He no longer has to prove he's strong, nor does he need to confess he was once weak. He simply lives and lets life happen without too much interference. Those who meet Pete at the age of 54 may not see the aura, but they will sense a deep calm, the result of a man who has paid history's full price and owes it nothing more. Pete Sampras is a legend who walked off the stage in his own way. He didn't turn his back on history. He set it down. He didn't seek to be remembered, didn't try to hold on to the echo. He only wanted peace, a simple desire he had postponed for too long. And in that quietness, for the first time, Pete Sampras isn't a name, isn't a record, isn't an icon. He is himself. Finally, Pete Sampras stepped out of his own story, not with a fall, nor with a moment of collapse that the world could name and pity. Pete Sampras left in a much quieter way. He paid the price, paid it day by day, season by season, decision by decision, not spoken, emotion by emotion, swallowed inward in exchange for a standard of perfection the world demanded but rarely understood. No late miracle came to erase those years. No final victory was powerful enough to transform silence into peace. All that remained was a man who had walked his entire path and accepted the price that path demanded. People love to tell stories where suffering is repaid with redemption, where wounds become brilliant lessons, where scars turn into medals. But Pete Sampras's life didn't fit those convenient molds. He wasn't fully healed, because some wounds formed from discipline that came too early, and silence that lasted too long, have no tidy conclusion. He also had no ultimate victory to declare that everything was worth it. The 14 Grand Slams stand there as a historic peak, but they carried no promise of inner liberation. Pete didn't find peace in the moment he lifted that final trophy. He only fulfilled a duty he had carried his whole life. What makes this tragedy so profound isn't what Pete Sampras lost, but what he never allowed himself to have. He didn't allow himself weakness when he was young, didn't allow himself confusion when success came too early, didn't allow himself to tell his story when the world was ready to listen. Every time he chose silence, the world chose to interpret for him. And those interpretations, cold, emotionless, machine, gradually became the coat he wore to survive. No one forced him to wear it. But once worn long enough, taking it off became more frightening than continuing to endure. In American culture, where we celebrate those who rise after falling, Pete Sampras is an uncomfortable paradox. He didn't fall to rise again. He stood his entire life, so he would never be permitted to fall. And the price of that not permitted was an emotional life narrowed down, tightly managed like a match tactic. He endured instead of complaining, maintained instead of exploring, completed instead of stopping to ask what he needed. That was endurance raised to a moral virtue, the kind America both admires and unwittingly encourages. Work to the end, keep yourself proper. Don't bother anyone with your pain. But endurance, no matter how noble, is still a price. Pete Sampras paid it with years, lived more as a name than as a human being, with victories that brought no joy, with silence that became the only language he believed was safe. He didn't collapse, and therefore he was never fully embraced in those moments of breakdown that the public easily empathizes with. He stood firm, and therefore he had to stand alone. No miracle arrived to make this story comfortable. Love came late and allowed him to breathe, but it didn't erase the frozen years. Fatherhood brought meaning, but it also carried wordless regret for choices that can't be remade. Leaving the spotlight brought quiet, but it didn't turn memories to dust. Pete Sampras didn't try to rewrite his life. He accepted it as the sum of character, discipline, and endurance values that made the legend, and also the values that took away the softest parts of a human being. Perhaps that's what makes this story touch America in a different way. It doesn't teach us how to rise after falling. It forces us to ask why we demand that some people never be allowed to fall. It doesn't praise miracles. It reminds us that not every great life has a smooth, satisfying ending. And it doesn't sugarcoat victory. It questions the silent price that victory exacts from those who accept carrying it. Pete Sampras didn't collapse. He simply lived his entire life in the silence that victory demanded. That silence wasn't a lack of courage. It was courage in its harshest form, enduring without calling for witnesses. And sometimes, that is the greatest tragedy. Not loud loss, but the parts of life shrunk down to fit a definition of success that was too narrow. When the story closes, there are no fireworks, no promises of healing, no final victory for us to lean on. Only an American man who paid the full price for perfection with his character, with his endurance, and with a lifetime of silence. And if there is anything worth honoring here, it isn't the numbers on the golden record, but the quiet integrity of a man who did everything right in the way he believed was necessary, even though the price paid would never be refunded. The story of Pete Sampras leaves behind a quiet but persistent sadness, because this isn't the tragedy of a man who fell, but the tragedy of a man who was never permitted to fall. From a childhood in a disciplined family lacking emotional embraces, Pete learned to be strong too early, learned to be silent to survive. When the U.S. Open 1990 placed a crown on a 19-year-old's head, it wasn't just glory. It was the first life-altering event. The right to mature slowly was taken away. Throughout his career, the world #1 ranking and 14 Grand Slams weren't rewards. They were burdens, forcing him never to tire, never to weaken, never to err. The moment he burst into tears at the Australian Open 1995 because of Tim Gullikson, the only spiritual father he had, was the rare time Pete allowed himself pain. And precisely because that pain was so real, he slammed the emotional door shut for the rest of his life. The U.S. Open 2002 victory, on paper the perfect ending, held inside only exhaustion. Retirement brought no loud crisis, just a slow fall into emptiness. Marriage to Bridget Wilson and fatherhood didn't heal him, but gave him the right to breathe, the right to stay without having to win. From this story, the lesson for Americans isn't in praising records, but in re-examining the definition of success. A society that honors resilience and victory needs to learn to respect weakness too, because if a person is only loved when they are strong, the price they pay may be a lifetime of silence. Pete Sampras reminds us that, sometimes, the greatest tragedy isn't failure, but success achieved by trading away the right to be oneself. If the quiet but weighty story of Pete Sampras touches you, subscribe to the channel so we can continue together exploring the hidden corners behind the glory of America's legends. Thank you for staying until the very last moment, and see you in the next video where victories will be revisited with understanding and compassion.